In one sector, an entire panzer division was destroyed. The barrage signaled the beginning of Operation Cobra, the Allied attempt to break out from Normandy. If it succeeded, the Allies would have the chance to advance toward Germany and gain total victory. But if the Germans frustrated this Allied offensive, they would have time to build up vital reinforcements. During the summer of 1944, the fighting in Normandy would be hampered by the difficult nature of the terrain. Small fields were enclosed by hedge-topped banks. Responsibility for the success or failure of this battle fell on the shoulders of U.S. General George S. Patton and German Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. On D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, the Allies had stormed ashore on the Normandy coast and secured all their beachheads. They also repulsed a German counterattack which was not mounted quickly enough to dislodge the Allies. By June the 10th, the 5 separate Allied beachheads had been consolidated into one. From this point, the Allies could reinforce and resupply their forces as they prepared to advance beyond the beachhead area. Initially, the plan called for the British and Canadians to advance on the Allied left. They would take Caen and then strike toward Paris. Simultaneously, U.S. forces would take Cherbourg to secure a port for the Allied Expeditionary Force. Then they would advance west, south, and east, and also head for Paris. The Allies had the advantage of total air superiority. They could harass German ground forces at will. By June the 11th, American forces were advancing through the Cotentin Peninsula and pressing toward the port of Cherbourg, despite German resistance. The Cherbourg garrison was eventually forced to surrender on June the 27th, but the Germans wrecked the harbor, making it unusable. Meanwhile, the British prepared to take the important city of Caen, southeast of the Allied beachhead. Despite massive aerial and artillery bombardments, 2 attempts to take Caen in June had failed. British and Canadian troops were held up by a series of fortified villages north of the city. The English Channel was swept by gales between June 19th and 22nd, which severely damaged the artificial mulberry harbors off the Normandy coast. This limited Allied reinforcements and supplies. The Allies also had problems adapting to the difficult terrain. The German defenders exploited this. The struggle persisted during the latter half of June and into July, as the Allies continued to build up reinforcements. Among this influx of manpower was the U.S. Third Army, led by General George S. Patton. Patton had earned his stripes in Tunisia and Sicily and was now looking for more combat. On the German side, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief in France, was removed by Adolf Hitler. He was replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge on July the 2nd. Von Kluge's prominent subordinate, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B. But on July the 17th, Rommel was seriously wounded when his car was hit by an Allied fighter. By mid-July, the situation was at a stalemate. Both the Allied and German high commands were being forced to rethink their strategies for the Battle of Normandy. Responsibility for deciding the struggle would rest with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and the newly arrived General George Patton. George Smith Patton was born in 1885 in California. His father was a well-to-do lawyer. At age 17, he went to the Virginia Military Institute. There, he acquired his love of both military history and poetry. In 1904, George Patton entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He was an average cadet academically, but excelled in sports and the drill field. At 24, Patton graduated and joined the U.S. Cavalry, quickly making his mark as a promising officer. Patton's first combat experience was as an aide to General Blackjack Pershing during his 1916 campaign against Mexican bandit Pancho Villa. When America declared war on Germany in April 1917, Patton was one of the first to head for Europe. He was instrumental in organizing the fledgling U.S. Tank Corps on the Western Front. Patton was given command of a brigade of French-built Renault light tanks. But he was seriously wounded during the American Meuse-Argonne offensive in October 1918. After the war, Patton returned to the cavalry. By 1938, he had risen to the rank of colonel. Although he had been a tank officer in World War I, Patton still believed in the primacy of the cavalry. But Germany's blitzkrieg on Poland during September 1939, and then on France in May and June 1940, changed his views dramatically. In the spring of 1940, Patton attended the U.S. Third Army maneuvers in Louisiana. This convinced him of the need for powerful tank forces in modern warfare. That summer, Patton was promoted to Brigadier General and then given command of the 2nd U.S. Armored Division, also known as Hell on Wheels. When America entered World War II, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Patton was ready for combat. He was chosen by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower to lead the Western Task Force for Allied landings in Northwest Africa in November 1942. Patton then distinguished himself during the fighting in Tunisia. He restored the morale of the U.S. Second Corps after it was beaten by Rommel at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Promoted to 3-star general, Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army's invasion of Sicily in July of that same year. As a flamboyant and outspoken leader, he soon came into conflict with British General Bernard Montgomery. Patton's relationship with Montgomery was, at best, formal. It led to constant friction. Despite his success in Sicily, Patton was censured for striking one of his own men who was suffering from shell shock. He almost brought his own career to an abrupt end. But Eisenhower had faith in Patton. He ensured that Patton did not go home in disgrace. Instead, Eisenhower kept Patton in Sicily until early 1944, certain that Patton still had a major role to play. It was a wise decision. The Germans believed that Patton was the most aggressive Allied commander, and that he would probably lead the expected invasion of Northwest Europe. Eisenhower knew of this German assessment. He therefore decided to use Patton as a decoy. Patton was appointed commander of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It helped convince the Germans that the main Allied landings on D-Day would be at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Once the Allies securely landed in Normandy, Eisenhower gave Patton a real opportunity: command of the U.S. Third Army in the Breakout battle. Patton had always been a larger-than-life character and an inspired military leader. He courted the press, and his forthright manner, flamboyant style, and stirring speeches before battle kept him in the public eye. Now, he would take on a challenge that could make him one of the greatest soldiers of his generation. Günther Hans von Kluge was born into a noble Prussian military family in 1882. At age 19, he joined the Artillery Division. In 1908, he attended the prestigious German War Academy. Von Kluge graduated in 1910 and joined the Greater General Staff. Throughout World War I, he served on the Western Front as an artillery and general staff officer. After the war, von Kluge moved up through the ranks of the German army. By the time Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in January 1933, von Kluge had become a major general. In 1937, von Kluge was made a full general. A year later, he was appointed to lead Germany's Army Command 6, renamed the Fourth Army at the start of World War II. He detested the Nazi regime. He was involved in a number of attempts to overthrow Hitler. However, he also became a great disciple of the Blitzkrieg. Von Kluge led the Fourth Army's invasion of Poland in September 1939 and its conquest of France in May and June 1940. By then, Hitler considered von Kluge one of his most able senior commanders. He honored von Kluge with a Field Marshal's baton in July. Von Kluge had continued success on the Eastern Front between the summer of 1941 and October 1943. He was given command of the German Army Group Center. But on the 12th of that month, he was seriously injured in a car crash. Von Kluge was still officially on sick leave when Hitler appointed him to replace von Rundstedt in Normandy in July 1944. He had the awesome task of injecting new will into an army which was buckling under the intense Allied pressure. By late July, both Patton and von Kluge knew that a decision in Normandy was imminent. In July 1944, George Patton addressed the men of his U.S. Third Army before they left for France. In his characteristic style, he told them to cut the guts out of the Krauts and to get the hell on to Berlin. But bitter German resistance in Normandy threatened to frustrate him. The British had run into problems around Caen, and the U.S. First Army's drive south after taking Cherbourg was also experiencing difficulties. Led by General Omar Bradley, the advance south had begun in the first days of July as planned. But the notorious terrain of hedgerows filled with German opposition slowed the advance to a crawl. By July 11th, Bradley's thrust had ground to a halt. A total stalemate seemed imminent. Allied casualties mounted. Only General Bernard Montgomery, who commanded the British 21st Army Group and was responsible for the Allied ground campaign, remained optimistic. Montgomery planned to finally take Caen and draw German panzer formations away from the Americans, who would then break out. Preceded by heavy bombers, Montgomery's third attack on Caen, codenamed Operation Goodwood, began on July 18, 1944. The main target for the Allied bombers was a group of fortified villages along the path of the advance. Three British armored divisions spearheaded the final assault. Dazed by the aerial bombardment, the Germans initially offered little resistance. But then British tanks were caught in carefully laid ambushes by German guns. The German fire became more intense and British tank casualties mounted rapidly. Caen was finally captured, but heavy tank casualties brought the attack to a halt. Eisenhower now wanted a change of pace in the Allied advance. On July 20th, he visited Montgomery and stressed that the Germans were too weak to launch a significant counteroffensive. He knew this based on Allied intercepts of Germany's top-secret Enigma code, which British analysts had deciphered. Eisenhower told Montgomery that the time for caution was over. He knew that Montgomery had drawn much of the German armor away from the American sector. Eisenhower believed that conditions were now right for an Allied offensive. The plan was for Bradley's 1st U.S. Army to punch through German defenses in the Saint-Lô area. Patton's 3rd Army would then pass through the resulting gap and break out. The advance would begin on July the 20th, the day Goodwood ended. Omar Bradley believed that preliminary carpet bombing by heavy bombers was crucial to the Allied breakout plan, codenamed Operation Cobra. Bradley planned to push through the gap made by the bombers with 3 infantry divisions, almost 40,000 troops, with 2 armored divisions and an infantry division in reserve. Operation Cobra would also be supported by massive heavy artillery bombardments and mobile artillery supporting ground forces. A specially adapted Sherman tank with a dozer blade, known as the Rhinoceros, was used to cut through banks and hedgerows. It would be Omar Bradley's decision when to let Patton's division loose. If it was too early, the danger was that Patton would become involved in the break-in battle. The 2 armies would become hopelessly intermingled. Too late, and the Germans might have the chance to close the gap Bradley created. Patton, therefore, had to accept that he had no control during the early phases of Cobra. It was difficult for a man of his impatience. Bad weather prevented Allied bombers from flying, so Cobra was postponed until July 24th. For Germany's von Kluge, defending Normandy against an Allied breakout attempt was a major headache. Von Kluge was severely hampered by Hitler's constant interference in his day-to-day defensive operations. Worse, von Kluge's Army Group B had suffered 95,000 casualties and lost 225 tanks. In spite of his pleas to Hitler, he had received few replacements. This frustration was exacerbated by the fact that on June the 22nd, the Red Army had launched a massive offensive on the Eastern Front, codenamed Operation Bagraten. Hitler ordered the bulk of German reinforcements to the east to stem the Russian tide. Von Kluge's forces in the west became a low priority. Consequently, his better trained and battle-hardened troops began suffering from combat fatigue. Casualties continued to mount. Von Kluge knew he had virtually no reserves. Unless he could redeploy his existing forces, he had little to halt an Allied breakout. But the difficult terrain of Normandy did give him a major advantage. His troops had imposed heavy losses on the Allied forces, and von Kluge was determined to exploit the hedgerows during the expected Allied offensive. While on the move, von Kluge's troops had to be vigilant against the ever-present threat of Allied air raids. The French infrastructure, railway lines, roads, and bridges were targeted relentlessly. Most rail and road movements were under constant attack by marauding Allied fighters and bombers. Both von Kluge and Patton realized that the differences between the Allies and Germany might come down to the quality and morale of their men, who would soon meet in the fields of France. Prior to D-Day, Allied training had focused on getting ashore. Little thought had been devoted to the problems of fighting inland. Even the battle-hardened American and British veterans of Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy had to learn fast in Normandy. The open countryside close to the beaches had rapidly given way to small fields, high hedgerows, and narrow lanes. Armored vehicles were particularly vulnerable to anti-tank fire. They were often unable to detect camouflaged German guns until it was too late. So the Allies were forced to alter their tactics and accept that progress was often very slow. Against a well-drilled and dogged enemy, the Allies discovered that fighting in these conditions was exhausting and nerve-wracking. It was particularly tough for infantrymen, since they suffered the highest casualty rates by far. But despite the problems, American and British troops were well supplied compared to their enemy. In England, Patton's U.S. Third Army troops were training and preparing. They still had a great deal to learn, but would soon be in France, fresh and impatient to make their mark. With Patton, they had no doubt that they would. Patton was respected by his men, who referred to themselves as Georgie's boys. On the German side, it was a totally different story. Many German soldiers were suffering from poor morale and combat fatigue. Added to this was the problem of resupply. The German forces were constantly harassed by Allied air and artillery bombardments. their need for constant vigilance added to the strain. Despite these problems, German units were still cohesive and strong defensively. German morale had been boosted a little by the heavy casualties they imposed on the British during Operation Goodwood, just days before Operation Cobra was to begin. Furthermore, their resolve was strengthened by the very real threat that an Allied breakout could lead to a swift and relentless advance into the heart of Germany itself. Many German troops were by now fighting for the sake of their loved ones at home rather than the Führer. Now, in the early evening of July the 23rd, 1944, German defenders around Saint-Lô, France, prepared for another uncertain night on the front line. It began to rain, adding to both sides' discomfort. For George Patton, waiting impatiently to exploit the breakthrough battle, and von Kluge, who knew an attack was imminent, the hour of destiny was almost at hand. Set to begin July 24th, 1944, Operation Cobra was postponed for 24 hours because of poor weather. But that message did not reach 335 of the 1,500 Allied bombers scheduled to blast German positions. They carried out their mission, bombing in bad visibility. In some places, the bombs fell on their own frontline troops. Over 150 Americans waiting to attack were killed or wounded. It seemed a bad omen. Operation Cobra began disastrously for General Omar Bradley. Fortunately, Bradley still had the element of surprise. Von Kluge's defenders believed that their own retaliatory fire had thwarted the American attack. Early on the morning of Tuesday, July the 25th, Operation Cobra was launched at last. It had been preceded by another huge aerial bombardment. The cracked German Panzerlehr Division was annihilated. It lost all of its 40 remaining tanks and 2/3 of its men. But once again, some of the bombs fell in the American lines, resulting in more casualties. Another 111 men were killed and almost 500 wounded. Among the dead was General Leslie McNair, commander of U.S. Army ground forces. He was in France on an inspection tour. McNair was the most senior U.S. officer killed in World War II. Despite the tragic bombing errors, the U.S. First Army's infantry assault began as planned at 11 a.m. By the end of the first day, it had broken through the gap left by the Panzerlehr Division and had advanced over 4,000 yards. At first, German resistance was as fierce as ever, but Bradley's First Army still broke through the German defenses by July the 27th. Bradley now sent the 2nd Armored Division through the gap, and it fought its way through to open country. Simultaneously, Allied aircraft began to annihilate the Luftwaffe's remaining planes, which were trying to defend the skies over von Kluge's embattled ground forces. By July 28th, the U.S. First Army had penetrated over 12 miles. Bradley decided that the moment had come to unleash Patton and his Third Army. The U.S. Third Army quickly went into motion with its characteristic aggression and decisiveness. On July 30th, Patton's troops captured the crucial road junction at Avranches against only token German opposition. Even so, von Kluge's die-hard, experienced defenders fought on, inflicting a number of casualties on Patton's eager troops as they rushed forward. Nevertheless, Patton's armored thrust could not be deterred. He released 4 divisions, including 500 tanks. They burst rapidly out of the hedgerows and onto the open roads and fields of France. As the breakout began to spread, von Kluge looked at his battle maps and realized his entire defense was beginning to unravel. Under further Allied air and ground attacks, his best Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units were disintegrating. Many divisions were reduced to mere skeletons. But some German forces stubbornly continued to stand and fight. They managed to slow Patton's thrust, even though von Kluge's men were on the verge of exhaustion. Pressing on, the U.S. Third Army was incorporated into Bradley's newly designated 12th Army Group on August 1st. 2 days later, Bradley ordered Patton to send only minimal forces into Brittany and move the bulk of his army to strike into the heart of France. Patton's Third Army rapidly swept the German resistance aside. On the same day, Hitler, who had rejected numerous requests from von Kluge for an immediate withdrawal, ordered 4 of his panzer divisions to counter Patton's swift advance. Within 24 hours, Patton's spearheads were already heading south, but von Kluge intended to strike Patton on his flank, cutting off his spearheads and halting the American advance near the town of Mortain. The forthcoming attack would be a make-or-break situation for von Kluge. During August 5th and 6th, 1944, Patton's Third Army continued its southeast advance from the Avranches Gap. Patton was everywhere, pushing his men and leading from the front in his characteristic style. But the further Patton advanced, the more his supply lines were stretched. This suited von Kluge. It gave him breathing space to launch the counterattack around Mortain that had been ordered by Hitler. The attack included 200 Panther and Tiger tanks from the remnants of 4 Panzer divisions and 1 Panzer Grenadier division. The attack on Patton's 7th Corps began on the evening of August 6th. By dawn on the 7th, it seemed that von Kluge's daring attack might work. It had caught some of Patton's units by surprise. His forces then captured Mortain and threatened to break through the U.S. 7th Corps' makeshift defenses. Somehow, the Americans held on in the villages and countryside around Mortain. Just to the east of Mortain, Hill 317 was critical. It was held by only one American battalion, which managed to withstand numerous German attacks. Patton's casualties were growing. But help was on the way. The Allies turned to their tactical air forces, now largely based in Normandy. The Allies planned to unleash them against von Kluge's panzers as they prepared for what their crews hoped would be a final and decisive assault. At dawn on August 7th, the German panzers came under their first air attacks. They were bombarded continually by both British and American fighter bombers. By evening, fewer than 30 German tanks were still in action. The counterattack had been stopped dead. Despite von Kluge's protests, Hitler insisted that his troops hold their positions around Mortain. But this was impossible. Von Kluge realized that he had no option but to attempt a general withdrawal. The opportunity now arose to cut off von Kluge's remaining forces in the Falaise pocket. After Mortain, Patton would swing up from the south, and the British and Canadians would squeeze the bulge from the north. The U.S. First Army would seal up the pocket from the west. The battle began with a brief but bloody hammering of many of von Kluge's units, principally from the air. Hitler was totally out of touch with the reality of the events on the ground. He continued to order futile counterattacks. Back in Normandy, the slaughter around the Falaise continued. Some troops of the German 7th and 5th Panzer armies managed to escape from the pocket. But the Allies effectively closed it on August 17th. "50,000 Germans were forced to surrender. Another 15,000 lay dead. On the day the Falaise pocket was sealed, Hitler dismissed von Kluge. He was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who found himself in charge of a rout. 2 days later, Patton's leading division crossed the River Seine. On August 25th, the French 2nd Armored Division liberated Paris. The battle for Normandy was over. The German forces had been smashed, and 250,000 German soldiers were dead or wounded. Another 200,000 were now prisoners of war. By the end of August 1944, the Allies had landed over 2 million men in Normandy. They had suffered 210,000 casualties, nearly 40,000 of whom had been killed in action. But they had broken out of Normandy and were now pushing toward Nazi Germany itself. But Patton became frustrated by the lack of progress after the Normandy breakout, as Eisenhower's strategy became more cautious. His moment came when Hitler launched a surprise German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. Patton mounted a brilliant counterstroke and stopped the German assault in its tracks. The Third Army then made spectacular crossings over the River Rhine. By the end of the war, it had advanced as far as Czechoslovakia. Patton's outstanding contribution was rewarded with a post-war appointment as military governor of Bavaria. But his restless nature and inherent distrust of the Soviet Union led to further friction with Eisenhower after the war. Patton was removed from the post. On December 10, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in a traffic accident. Tragically, he died 11 days later. Patton was buried with full military honors in Germany, next to the men of his own Third Army. Despite his controversial nature, Patton remains a legendary figure today. Von Kluge's popularity plummeted after he failed to hold Patton in Normandy. Worse, he was implicated in the abortive July plot to assassinate Hitler. He was ordered to stand trial along with his fellow conspirators. He returned to Berlin. En route, von Kluge committed suicide in some woods in eastern France. Operation Cobra, which began the breakout from Normandy, ultimately proved to be a spectacular Allied achievement. Hitler's European fortress had been shattered, and his armies appeared broken. For the brilliant George Patton, the breakout was a triumph. But for Günther von Kluge, it had been a disastrous and fatal clash of warriors.